September 12th, 1945. Pier 52, New York Harbor. The morning fog clung to the water like a secret. 847 German women had been told to expect monsters, cruelty, and hunger the moment they set foot on American soil. Their hearts pounded as the ship docked, every clank of metal and hiss of steam a reminder of the horrors they feared. Then a soldier stepped forward, calm, and a translator quietly said, "Close your eyes." What they saw when they opened them was nothing they had imagined. Hot showers, clean towels, and food waiting for them. No punishments, no humiliation, just kindness. Simple, ordinary, shocking kindness. This was not propaganda, this was reality, and it would change them forever. If you want to see how mercy turned fear into tears and reshaped their world, hit like, subscribe, and watch the full story. You won't believe what happened next. The morning air over New York Harbor felt heavy with fog and silence as the transport ship eased toward Pier 52. For the 847 German women standing on deck, every noise sounded like a warning. The scrape of ropes, the clank of metal, the low hum of engines. For weeks they had been told that this moment would bring punishment. Many believed they would be marched into cruelty the moment they stepped onto American soil. Propaganda had taught them that Americans hated them, that captivity meant beatings, starvation, and shame. But when the harbor came into view, the first shock arrived quietly. Instead of broken buildings, they saw tall, untouched skylines. Instead of ruins, they saw white trucks, clean sidewalks, and rows of brick warehouses that looked almost peaceful. Some of the women whispered that it had to be a trick. A few crossed themselves. One prisoner, later remembering that morning, wrote, "It felt unreal, as if the war had happened only in our country, not here." A US officer called out orders, calm and professional. There were no screams, no raised weapons. The women noticed this difference instantly. Their own country's officers shouted. These Americans spoke in firm but even voices. A translator stepped forward and guided them down the ramp in small groups. The smell of the harbor, salt, diesel, wet wood, mixed with another smell drifting from somewhere deeper in the city. Coffee, real coffee. For many of the women, it was the first time in years they had smelled something warm and normal. They were loaded into military trucks. As the convoy moved through the streets, the women stared out of the small windows. They saw long lines of shops with bright signs, bakeries filled with bread, and children in clean clothes walking to school. A few women felt their throats tighten. Back home, Germany's cities were silent, except for wind moving through broken homes. Food was almost gone. Many families survived on scraps. The contrast was too large to understand. Even the numbers told the truth. In 1945, America produced more than 200 million pounds of butter and kept grocery stores supplied in every major city. In Germany, the average civilian ration at the same time often fell below 1,000 calories a day. The women knew this. They had lived it. And now they watched a country untouched by hunger. One of the women, a former nurse named Elsa, whispered, "How can they have so much?" Another answered, "Because we were lied to." But even she did not fully believe her own words yet. The trucks finally reached a fenced military camp. It looked exactly like what they feared. Tall wire, guard towers, soldiers at the gates. Their hearts tightened. The earlier calm streets felt like a dream. They prepared themselves again for cruelty. But as they stepped out, the first thing they noticed was strange. The paths were swept clean. The buildings were freshly painted. A German-speaking officer was waiting with clipboards, not weapon. He explained the rules clearly and without anger. The women listened in silence, confused by this unexpected order and calm. What they saw next would break their expectations even more. The moment that followed would change everything they believed about enemies, war, and the world they came from. They were led toward a long, low building with steam drifting from small vents along the roof. Many of the women froze. In German camps, steam often meant punishment or humiliation. Several whispered prayers expecting the worst. A few held their breath as they stepped inside, but the room they entered was nothing like they imagined. There were real shower stalls, separate, curtained, private. The floor was clean, the air smelled of warm water, and something unfamiliar, yet comforting, floral soap. On a wooden table near the entrance lay stacks of white towels and neatly folded cotton gowns. An American sergeant pointed to the items and spoke through the translator. They were to wash thoroughly. Their old clothes would be taken away, cleaned if possible, or burned if filled with lice. The women did not move at first. One of them later wrote, "I thought it was a trick. Why offer dignity to prisoners?" But a guard simply nodded toward the stalls and stepped aside. No shouting, no pushing. Greta, only 23, picked up a bar of soap. It felt smooth, heavier than the grey wartime soap she knew. The smell reminded her of peacetime. Small shops, her mother's hands, clean mornings before the war tore everything apart. When she turned the tap, hot water burst out with surprising force. Real hot water, not the lukewarm trickle she had known in Germany. It ran over her face, her hair, her arms, washing away sweat and dust from the 3-week ocean trip. Around her, she heard soft crying. No one sobbed loudly. It was the quiet, almost confused kind of tears people cry when they suddenly feel safe after too long. For years, Germany's water systems had been destroyed. Bombings had torn apart pipelines, leaving many families with only cold or contaminated water. Here, however, the United States was using millions of gallons every day for ordinary needs. Baths, laundry, kitchens. The difference was overwhelming. The women knew the numbers too. By late 1945, more than 80% of German cities had damaged water networks, while American bases maintained fully functioning systems. Greta pressed her face into her hands as the water poured down. She didn't know why she felt so emotional. Maybe it was the warmth. Maybe it was the privacy. Maybe it was simply being treated like a human being when she expected the opposite. After the shower, attendants handed out clean gowns and simple canvas shoes. The fabric felt soft against their skin. Many had not worn anything clean in months. One woman whispered, "It feels wrong to be comfortable," and several others quietly agreed. Yet the surprise was not finished. They were told that a warm meal was waiting in the mess hall. The idea felt unreal. Food, right after a hot shower. Their hearts beat faster as they walked across the yard. They did not know it yet, but what they would see inside the dining hall would shake their beliefs even more deeply. The smell reached them before they even entered the building. A warm mix of cooked meat, butter, and fresh bread. For a moment, many of the women stopped walking. Some looked around as if expecting someone to shout that it was a mistake. Others simply stared at the doorway, afraid to hope. Inside, long metal tables were lined with trays, cups, and steaming plates. American cooks worked calmly behind the counter, serving food as if this were an ordinary evening for them. But for the German women, it felt unreal. They had lived through years of rationing, lines for turnips, and meals that barely reached 700 calories a day. Here, food filled every corner of the room. A military cook placed a plate in Greta's hands. Potatoes, green beans, a thick slice of meatloaf, a piece of soft white bread, a small square of butter, and a cup of hot coffee. She stared at the butter longest. She had not tasted it in 2 years. Her younger brother Fritz had died begging for bread during the final winter of the war. The memory struck her hard. She felt both hunger and guilt tearing at her. Others felt the same. One woman whispered, "My children are starving, and I am eating this?" Another answered quietly, "We have no choice. We are alive." No one said it with pride. They said it with confusion. Still, their bodies reacted faster than their emotions. As soon as they took the first bite, the shock softened into silent relief. The potatoes were warm and smooth. The bread was soft, not the coarse wartime loaves filled with sawdust and barley husks. The butter melted instantly on the tongue. The coffee was strong and bitter, but it felt like fuel returning to their veins. A few women cried quietly over their plates, not because the food was extraordinary, but because it reminded them of everything they had lost. At home, Germany's farms were ruined. By late 1945, crop yields had dropped by almost half. Urban families often survived on soup kitchens or black market scraps. Here, in an enemy camp, dinner included more calories than many German families received in 3 days. The paradox felt impossible. Safety in a prison, abundance in a place meant for captives. Greta wrote later in her notebook, "I do not understand. The enemy feeds us better than our leaders ever did." It frightened her more than cruelty would have. Cruelty made sense. Kindness did not. After they finished eating, the women were assigned bunks in clean, heated barracks. Blankets were folded neatly. Mattresses were soft. There were lamps on every table. Even the air smelled different. A mix of wood, soap, and warm dust. But as they lay down, sleep did not come easily. Their stomachs were full for the first time in years, but their hearts were restless. Every comfort raised new questions about the world they thought they understood, and the days ahead would only deepen that confusion. Morning in the camp began with a clear bell and the sound of boots on gravel. The women lined up outside their barracks, still trying to understand the strange rhythm of this new life. Instead of harsh orders, the American guard spoke in calm voices, explaining the day's routine. The goal was simple: work, meals, rest. Nothing more. It felt unreal for people who had expected punishment. Most of the women were assigned to laundry duty. The laundry building smelled of warm fabric, soap, and steam. Inside, large washing machines rumbled steadily. Some women folded shirts and trousers, others pressed uniforms under heavy irons that hissed quietly. The work was tiring but familiar, the kind of labor many had done at home long before the war. It offered something they hadn't felt in months: a sense of structure. For each day of work, they received small wages. Not much, usually around 80 cents a day, but enough to buy tiny comforts from the camp canteen. A few bought chocolate for the first time since 1942. Others bought pencils, notebooks, or a small tin of hand cream. Greta used her first wages to buy paper. She wanted to write down everything she saw, everything she felt. In one entry, she wrote, "They treat us like people. I don't know how to accept it." The paradox grew stronger each day. They were prisoners, yet the guards greeted them politely. They lived behind fences, yet the environment was cleaner than many German hospitals. They were supposed to be the enemy, yet the soldiers offered them coffee during breaks and helped them understand the camp rules without yelling or insults. Even the numbers reflected the difference. American POW camps in 1945 provided around 3,000 calories per day to prisoners, while German civilian rations often dropped below 1,000. Still, the women struggled internally. Each meal, each clean shirt, and each small kindness reminded them of the people suffering back home. Parents trading their last possessions for food, children searching through ruins for anything edible, whole cities waiting for aid that arrived too slowly. Guilt was a constant companion. At night, the barracks glowed with soft yellow lamps. Some women read borrowed books. Others wrote letters or stared at the ceiling, replaying the same troubling thought. Why is the enemy kinder than our own leaders were? One evening, an American guard placed a box of extra apples near the door. "Take one if you want," he said. The women looked at him as if he had handed them gold. Apples had vanished from Germany's markets long before the war ended. Something so simple felt like a reminder of a world they had lost. But comfort did not silence doubt. The more the women settled into the routine, the more their beliefs felt unstable. Everything they had been taught, who was superior, who was cruel, who was the enemy, no longer matched what they saw with their own eyes. And soon they would face something even harder, the truth that the Americans wanted them to see for themselves. In December 1945, the camp organized a special film screening. The women were led into a large room with wooden benches, the smell of cold dust and polished floors mixing with the faint aroma of coffee from the nearby mess hall. The lights dimmed. Greta and the others held their breath. They had been warned something serious would be shown, but no one could imagine the truth that waited on the screen. The first images were almost impossible to believe. Concentration camps, Bergen-Belsen, Dachau, Buchenwald, appeared on the screen in black and white. Piles of bodies, faces hollowed by starvation, prisoners who could barely walk. Smoke rose from chimneys, doors opened to gas chambers. The room was silent except for the low hum of the projector. For many of the women, it was the first time they had seen the extreme suffering their leaders had inflicted. The scale of death was overwhelming. Greta wrote later, "I had feared the enemy, but this horror could have justified hatred, and yet they had chosen mercy, mercy." The word repeated in their minds like a strange echo. These Americans, the same people who fed them, bathed them, and spoke kindly in Bachtal, had seen these atrocities. They had every reason to treat the German women harshly. They could have punished them for being part of the Nazi war effort, but instead they offered dignity, food, and care. The contrast broke down every lesson they had learned about their supposed superiority and the cruelty of the enemy. The statistics alone were staggering. By 1945, more than 6 million Jews had been murdered in the Holocaust. Millions of others suffered in forced labor and starvation. And yet the Americans in the camp provided nearly 4,000 calories a day to each prisoner, maintained heating in the barracks, and ensured medical care, acts that were deliberate, organized, and humane. The women could see it in every detail: clean floors, steaming meals, functioning showers. This wasn't propaganda, it was reality. The moral collapse among the prisoners was silent but deep. For Greta, every act of kindness forced her to question everything. Her diary filled with reflections. I do not know who I am anymore. The girl who believed in lies is gone. They have shown me what my people never did. Mercy is not weakness. It is power. Some women wept quietly in the back rows. Some pressed their hands together, whispering prayers they hadn't said in months. Others simply sat in stunned silence, trying to reconcile the images on the screen with the gestures of the Americans they had met every day. The paradox was painful. They were prisoners, yet safe. They had been taught to fear the enemy, yet they were treated like humans. They had expected cruelty, yet received mercy. Each woman felt the tension between guilt for surviving and awe at the care they were shown. As the projector clicked off and the lights returned, the women left the room changed. The world they had known, one of propaganda, hatred, and scarcity, was replaced with a confusing, unsettling truth. Kindness could exist even in war, even from those they were taught to hate. And soon they would carry that understanding back to Germany, along with the burden of guilt and the spark of a new perspective on mercy, humanity, and their own people. By February 1946, the 847 German women were preparing to leave the camp. The cold wind bit at their faces as they stood in formation one last time, the fences and guard towers behind them feeling both protective and strange. They had come expecting punishment, humiliation, and hardship. Instead, they were leaving the knowledge that ordinary people could choose kindness even when given every right to cruelty. This understanding transformed them, shaping their interactions, their reflections, and the stories they later told to children and grandchildren. The paradox of their experience stayed with them. They had expected enemies and found human. They had expected cruelty and found care. They had left a safe, abundant country and returned to ruin, carrying guilt, awe, and a deep moral lesson. In time, this paradox would define the way they viewed mercy, judgment, and the responsibility of one generation to the next. The story of those 847 women, led by the experiences of Greta Hartmann, shows a simple truth. Even in the worst circumstances, human beings can choose dignity over cruelty. They had come as prisoners, afraid of punishment, and left as witnesses to mercy. They had come expecting the worst, and discovered a world far more complex, far more human than propaganda had taught them. They had come as conquerors of circumstance. They left as students of humanity. In the end, the greatest weapon of their captors was not force or fear, but mercy, abundance, and the quiet power of treating others as human. The journey of these German women from fear to understanding teaches us that kindness can reshape perception. Every hot shower, every warm meal, every small act of care dismantled years of propaganda and hatred. Greta Hartmann and the others returned to Germany with bodies restored and minds forever altered. They carried guilt for surviving, awe for mercy, and a lesson they would pass on, that human dignity cannot be forced, it must be chosen. Across nations and decades, the paradox remains close behind them, feeling both protective and strange. They had come expecting punishment, humiliation, and hardship. Instead, they were leaving fed, clothed, and treated with dignity. The paradox weighed heavily on their minds. The journey home was quiet. On the ship, Greta wrote in her notebook, "I go back with clean hands and full stomachs, but my country is starving. How can I face them?" She thought of parents trading scraps for their children, neighbors rummaging through rubble for bread. Returning as a healthy, nourished woman felt like a betrayal. Every meal she had eaten in America replayed in her mind, each bite a reminder of the suffering back home. When they finally stepped onto German soil, the contrast was jarring. Cities were broken, streets empty, and the winter air sharp with frost and smoke. People stared at the returning women, some in relief, others with suspicion. Greta's old neighbor asked softly, "You were in America?" Greta nodded. "Yes, a prisoner." The neighbor looked her over and said, "You look well." Nothing more was said, but the silence held weight. The women had survived the enemy's mercy and now had to reconcile it with the devastation around them. Even in ruined towns, small acts of kindness remained memorable. The lessons of the camp, clean showers, proper meals, respectful treatment, stayed with them. Greta carried the memory of the bar of soap that smelled of flowers, a symbol of unexpected mercy. It reminded her that humanity could exist even in the darkest times. She wrote, "Mercy is not weakness, it is strength, and it teaches us who we really are." Back home, rebuilding life was slow. Families struggled with rationing, homes were damaged, and the city's rhythm was broken. Yet the women returned with something that could not be destroyed, the knowledge that ordinary people could choose kindness even when given every right to cruelty. This understanding transformed them, shaping their interactions, their reflections, and the stories they later told to children and grandchildren. The paradox of their experience stayed with them. They had expected enemies and found human. They had expected cruelty and found care. They had left a safe, abundant country and returned to ruin, carrying guilt, awe, and a deep moral lesson. In time, this paradox would define the way they viewed mercy, judgment, and the responsibility of one generation to the next. The story of those 847 women, led by the experiences of Greta Hartmann, shows a simple truth. Even in the worst circumstances, human beings can choose dignity over cruelty. They had come as prisoners, afraid of punishment, and left as witnesses to mercy. They had come expecting the worst, and discovered a world far more complex, far more human than propaganda had taught them. They had come as conquerors of circumstance. They left as students of humanity. In the end, the greatest weapon of their captors was not force or fear, but mercy, abundance, and the quiet power of treating others as human. The journey of these German women from fear to understanding teaches us that kindness can reshape perception. Every hot shower, every warm meal, every small act of care dismantled years of propaganda and hatred. Greta Hartmann and the others returned to Germany with bodies restored and minds forever altered. They carried guilt for surviving, or for mercy, and a lesson they would pass on, that human dignity cannot be forced, it must be chosen. Across nations and decades, the paradox remains clear. Cruelty is easy, mercy is hard, but its power is immeasurable. The camp, the soap, the meals, simple details, proved that even in the darkest moments, humanity can prevail, and those who choose it leave a lasting legacy.